Have you ever tried to teach someone a new skill? Just totally one-on-one.
Oh, like pouring your heart into it.
Exactly, like walking them through every single step week after week. And then, a year later you check in and you realize they still just cannot do it
Right, let
themselves.
alone teach it to anybody else.
Right. It is this incredibly specific and honestly exhausting type of frustration.
You put in all that time, you provide, all the correct information, but the actual transfer of capability it just fails to happen.
Yeah.
It leaves you staring at the wall, wondering where the disconnect is in your method.
And that exact frustration is actually the launch pad for what we are unpacking today. So welcome to our deep dive. I'm your host, and today our stack of sources comes from an organization called the Global Discipleship Initiative, or GDI.
Specifically, their Go Micro materials, right?
Yeah, the Go Micro materials. And our mission today is to analyze the mechanics of this really fascinating, decentralized, rapid growth model of instruction that they call MicroGroups.
It's a really deep system.
It is. Now, I do want to note right up front, these sources are heavily rooted in Christian theology and church strategy.
Very much so.
But our goal today isn't to, take a theological stance or endorse a specific religious worldview.
Right, we're looking at the structure.
Exactly. We are just impartially exploring the organizational psychology here. Because, honestly, regardless of your worldview, the way this group hacks human behavior to scale leadership is just brilliant.
It really is. It challenges our most basic assumptions about how human beings actually learn, how they gain the confidence to lead, and, how a movement actually sustains itself over multiple generations without just collapsing.
Right, without collapsing under its own weight.
Yeah.
So to understand the mechanics, we have to start with the failure that triggered it all.
Yeah.
Sources introduce us to this guy, Greg Ogden, back in the 1980s.
Yeah, and Ogden was practicing what most people they'd consider it the absolute gold standard of mentorship. He was meeting with men one-on-one for the better part of a year, taking them through rigorous foundational doctrines, teaching them spiritual disciplines like deep study and meditation, and helping them apply all of this to their daily lives.
Which sounds great, right? On paper, that level of personalized attention just seems flawless.
You'd think so. But the text highlights a massive systemic problem. At the end of that whole year of intense investment, Ogden expected these men to be equipped to go out and replicate the exact same process with someone else.
He expected exponential growth.
Exactly. But instead, he saw almost zero reproduction. The investment basically just stopped with the person he trained.
The source actually quotes Ogden applying that classic definition of insanity to his own work. The one doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results.
Right, right.
And I love that he didn't blame the students. He realized his foundational structure was fundamentally broken.
Which is a tough pill to swallow. But that realization led him to two massive epiphanies that completely overhauled his methodology.
Okay, let's get into those.
So the first epiphany was about the material itself, the content. The sources describe Ogden jogging on a high school track one day, not even actively thinking about his frustrations with disciple making, when he felt like, quote, an arrow out of the sky hit him.
Wow.
Yeah. The entire structure for a new curriculum basically just downloaded into his brain. He went home, mapped it out, and that material eventually became a workbook called Discipleship Essentials.
And the text notes, this workbook has now been translated into over 30 languages, which is wild.
It's massive. But as you know, a solid workbook is great, but having better reading material does not solve the structural problem.
Right. How do you actually teach it to ensure the student becomes a teacher themselves?
Exactly. Which brings us to the second, and honestly, arguably more important, epiphany. This one was about the context.
The environment.
Right. While Ogden was doing his Doctor of Ministry project, he decided to rigorously test his new curriculum across 3 different structural settings. He tried teaching it one-on-one, he tried it in a standard group of 10 people, and then, at the suggestion of his supervisor, he tried it in a tiny group of 3.
And he went in assuming the one-on-one setting would be the best, right?
Yeah.
It would yield the deepest intimacy.
That was his assumption, but instead he noticed the stark difference in his own physical and mental energy.
Right. He reported going into those one-on-one meetings feeling tired, but he would leave the group of 3 with excitement, elevated energy.
Yeah, he realized a fundamental geometric truth, basically.
Yeah.
One-on-one is not a circle, but 3 is.
I love that phrase, one-on-one is not a circle. I was thinking about it like a game of ping pong.
A I like that.
Right. In ping pong, all the pressure rests solely on the two players. If I hit the ball to you, you have to hit it back.
You can't just zone out.
Exactly. If one of us gets tired or distracted or just doesn't know what to say, the ball drops and the energy of the room totally dies. And maintaining that over a year is just exhausting.
Too much pressure.
But a group of three, it acts more like a campfire. Everyone can feed the flame. If I'm quiet for a minute because I'm like processing an idea, you and the third person are still keeping the fire going. You actually leave the interaction drawing on the collective energy.
Rather than just depleting your own. The sources actually refer to this specific combination. The right curriculum paired with that campfire dynamic of a tiny group as the secret sauce.
The secret sauce.
Yeah, when you put a biblically based curriculum, which is the content, into a transformational setting, the context, you create what the texts call hothouses of the Holy Spirit.
Meaning the conditions for accelerated growth are perfectly calibrated.
Exactly.
But, okay, since a group of three clearly solves the energy drain, how do you actually design one of these sessions so it doesn't just devolve into three friends complaining about their week for an hour?
That is the danger, right? But the sources lay out a highly specific architecture for these microgroups. The parameters are rigid by design.
So what are the rules?
A microgroup consists of exactly 3 to 4 people, no more, no less. They meet weekly for 90 minutes.
Okay, substantial time.
Yeah. And they enter into a mutual covenant, like a signed agreement, to explore the core curriculum together. But the absolute most vital architectural shift here is what the sources describe as moving from rows to a circle.
Ah, okay. That touches directly on the psychology of seating arrangements.
It really does.
Like, think about sitting in rows, like in a traditional classroom or a lecture hall or, a church pew. The physical structure of the room is silently broadcasting a power dynamic to the audience.
It's as you listen, I teach.
You follow, I lead.
Exactly. And the text points out that this traditional structure unintentionally manufactures dependency and passivity.
People just consume.
Right. The participants might be absorbing wonderful information, but they are absolutely not preparing to take the reins.
Right.
However, when you dissolve the rows and shift to a circle of just 3 or 4 people, the hierarchy just collapses into peer-to-peer engagement.
Because there is literally nowhere to hide in a circle of three. You cannot be a spectator. Everyone has to participate, everyone speaks, and everyone actively practices the material.
You're on the spot, but in a safe way.
But if I'm the listener, I might be wondering here, doesn't this setup run a huge risk?
What do you mean?
Well, if you remove the certified expert from the room and you share leadership among a tiny group of peers, doesn't that generate a feedback loop of bad information? Like the blind leading the blind. How does this structure actually prepare someone to lead accurately?
That's a great question, and the sources anticipate that exact concern. They solve it through what is essentially an embedded internship model.
Okay, how does that work?
So the facilitator of the microgroup does not act like a traditional lecturer. Their role is much closer to an intern supervisor. During the first third of the workbook, the facilitator models how to lead the discussion.
They show them the ropes.
Right. They demonstrate the necessary vulnerability, they show how to ask guiding questions, and then once that baseline is established, the participants actually take turns leading the group themselves for the remainder of the session.
Oh, wow. So it provides a really safe, low-stakes environment for them to gain confidence.
Exactly. It totally demystifies the act of leading. And to keep this internship model from losing its focus, the text grounds the entire process in a 5-part operational framework using the acronym GRITS.
G-R-I-T-S, GRITS.
Yep. It stands for Generational, Relational, Intentional, Transformational, and Spirit-Energized.
Okay, let's break those down. What are the mechanics behind each of those? Let's start with generational.
So generational means the expectation is built in from day one that this group will eventually end.
It's not a forever thing.
No, it's not a permanent club, and each member will start their own group. Then you have relational, which highlights that growth requires an environment of transparent trust. If people are just swapping academic facts, the group fails. They have to share their actual lives.
All right, which brings us to intentional. That's where that covenant comes into play, right?
Yes, precisely.
It forces a psychological commitment up front so people don't just, ghost the group when life gets busy.
It demands a purposeful investment of time. Then, transformational dictates the end metric of the group. The goal isn't just checking off pages in a workbook. It's measuring actual changes in character and behavior.
And the last one, Spirit-Energized.
That points to the underlying theological mechanism. The pressure isn't on the human leader to force change in someone else. The text emphasizes the belief that the Holy Spirit is the actual power source fueling the transformation.
Which removes a massive psychological burden from the facilitator. Like,
Mhm.
information alone does not transform. Relationships do.
Exactly.
But that brings us to the ultimate metric of success for this entire system. We had to transition from looking at the internal dynamics of the microgroup to its ultimate external goal.
The multiplication phase.
Right. A successful group isn't defined by the three people sitting in the circle enjoying themselves. It's defined by what they do after the final session.
And the text is unapologetically explicit about this. Disciple making is not proven by starting, it's proven by multiplying. It draws a very sharp contrast between addition and multiplication.
Because addition looks incredibly successful on the surface, right? You're gathering a massive crowd or teaching a packed class.
But addition is an organizational trap. It feels like momentum, but if the process stops with you, if your students never become teachers, it completely fails the sustainability test.
Yeah, the text brings up the fourth generation rule, which I found fascinating. It's a benchmark for measuring actual multiplication.
Yeah. The fourth generation rule is based on a specific biblical pattern found in the book of 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 2.
Right.
It outlines 4 distinct generations of knowledge transfer. You have Paul, who teaches Timothy, that's 1 and 2. Timothy is then instructed to entrust this knowledge to faithful people, that's generation 3, who will in turn teach others. That's the 4th generation.
Paul to Timothy to faithful people to others.
Exactly. And the organizational principle at play here is that if a movement stops before that 4th generation, it is not truly multiplying.
Because the third generation still has the gravitational pull of the original founder, right?
Yes. Only by the 4th generation is the DNA proven to replicate independently.
This is where the psychology of reproduction just really shines to me. Because in a traditional hierarchical structure, a person sits in a row, they look at the charismatic, highly educated speaker on stage, and they think, I could never do that.
I don't have the degree, I don't have the polish.
I don't have the stage presence. But in a microgroup, you look across a coffee table at your peer, who is like fumbling through the workbook and sharing their struggles just like you, and your internal narrative shifts. You think, oh, I could do this with a few other people.
It lowers the barrier to entry so drastically that leadership goes from being an elite calling to just a basic expectation.
Okay, I am looking at the geometry of this model, though, and I have to raise a skeptical pushback here.
Let's hear it.
Okay, let's unpack this. One person recruits 3 people. They go through a 90-minute weekly program. Then, each of those 3 is expected to go out and recruit 3 more people, going 4 generations deep.
Mathematically.
Mathematically, that forms a pyramid. Structurally, isn't this just a spiritual, multi-level marketing scheme?
Right.
Like an MLM?
Structurally, it's very easy to see why someone would map it out and see a pyramid, but the text draws a very sharp distinction when it analyzes the motives and the actual flow of power within the system.
Okay, how so?
Well, a multi-level marketing scheme is specifically designed to centralize power and funnel profit up to the top of the pyramid. The entire system is built to serve the founder.
Right, the person at the top gets rich.
Exactly. The microgroup model is engineered to do the exact opposite. It aggressively decentralizes authority.
So the original leader isn't trying to build, like, a massive downline of dependence.
Far from it. The sources emphasize that the original mandate, the Great Commission, was given to all believers, not just a ceremonial hierarchy or a professional clergy class. The goal isn't to build a fan base that relies on the person at the top. The goal is to form independent, mature followers.
That makes sense.
In fact, a successful original leader in the microgroup model essentially makes themselves obsolete. They distribute their authority completely, equipping the next generation to function entirely without their supervision.
You aren't recruiting people to serve your vision. You are equipping people so they don't need you anymore. That is a radically different power dynamic than an MLM.
Totally different.
But, theory is one thing. If this structure is so mathematically sound, what happens when it hits the friction of real human behavior?
Yeah.
We need to look at how this scales in the real world.
Yeah, and the sources provide some deeply compelling case studies to show exactly that. Let's look at Evangel Assembly in Wilbraham, Massachusetts. Over a 3-year period, they committed to this microgroup process, and they organically grew from just 2 microgroups to 20.
Think about the math on that.
Yeah.
That isn't just adding attendees to a crowd. That means 60 to 80 people in a single congregation are now actively leading or preparing to lead small, intensive groups.
Right. It fundamentally shifts the entire power structure of the community. And the momentum didn't remain localized either.
What happened next?
Because of that dense leadership capacity, they actually started hosting Northeast regional disciple-making forums. And the fascinating part is that the text notes these forums were organized and led entirely by local discipleship leaders from the region itself.
Oh, wow. So it wasn't corporate executives flying in from headquarters to put on a show.
Exactly. The local leaders took total ownership. They're even partnering now with African diaspora churches in their region, which proves that this microstructure translates across vastly different cultural contexts without needing a massive budget.
That is incredible. And there's another powerful case study in the sources that revolves around Terry English.
Ah, yes. Enter L.
Yeah, he is the president of Enter L, which is an organizational consulting group that works primarily with youth ministries across Central and Eastern Europe. In 2024, GDI hired him as a consultant to help them scale and refine their global vision.
Right. He was literally paid to analyze their model. But as he looked under the hood of the Gigo strategy, he realized it solved a massive friction point in his own work.
Right.
He noted that his youth ministries in Europe were fantastic at running, quote, evangelistic programs. They could draw a crowd, they could create an emotional high, but they severely struggled to turn those attendees into mature, reproducing leaders.
Which is that classic addition versus multiplication trap we talked about.
Exactly. And he saw that the microgroup model was the specific structural fix required to move beyond just event management. He was so convinced by the mechanics of it that he actually transitioned from being just a consultant for GDI to becoming an active practitioner.
Wow.
Yeah, he adopted the model for his own church networks in Europe.
It is a massive endorsement when the consultant basically buys the product.
Truly.
But let's be realistic about human nature for a second, because change is hard. Taking on responsibility is intimidating. The sources are actually surprisingly honest about what keeps people from adopting this model.
Yeah.
We've talked about the structural barriers of sitting in rows, but what about the internal psychological barriers?
Yeah, the text catalogs a series of what it calls quiet pushbacks.
Quiet pushbacks.
Yeah, these are the highly relatable, everyday excuses people use to dodge the responsibility of leading a microgroup. It's the person saying, I don't feel equipped enough to lead, or my schedule is just too busy right now.
Or, I just want to be a normal Christian. I don't want to get into all that heavy leadership stuff.
Exactly. They want the identity of the group without the cost of the surrender.
So how do the sources counter that resistance? Because you can't just tell someone who genuinely feels inadequate to, try harder.
Right. The counter-argument in the text shifts the entire paradigm. They argue that adopting this mission is an issue of obedience, not an issue of personality or theological knowledge or skill set.
Duh.
The text explicitly states, you are not the source. Jesus works through you. By completely removing the burden of having to be the smartest person in the room, it changes the internal question from, can I do this, to, will I yield to this process?
Ah, that's a flip.
It frames the refusal to participate not as a lack of skill, but as a direct resistance to the core foundational command of their faith.
Wow. So it just completely strips away the excuse of incompetence. So what happens when a community actually pushes through that internal resistance and adopts this decentralized model at scale? What is the final result?
The sources describe this ultimate cultural tipping point. It's the moment when disciple-making shifts from being viewed as a program or a specialized ministry department that a few highly motivated people run to simply becoming the air the church breathes.
The air the church breathes. That phrasing captures the goal perfectly. It means the process has become the normal, expected rhythm of daily life. When new people enter the community, they don't expect to be catered to indefinitely. They look around and simply expect that they will eventually be leading others, because that is what everyone else is doing.
It creates a fully self-sustaining ecosystem. The culture itself begins to drive the multiplication organically rather than relying on an administrative push from top-level management.
So bringing this all together for the listener, whether you are deeply invested in church dynamics or you are simply fascinated by organizational leadership and how human beings transfer knowledge, the massive takeaway from these Go micro materials is the sheer power of structural design.
It's all in the structure.
We have to examine our defaults.
Yeah.
We have to recognize the trap of passive consumption, sitting in rows waiting for the designated expert to feed us information. The real growth, the real multiplication, happens when we force active, reproducible participation by shifting into tiny circles where everyone has to carry the fire.